Good morning. I am your host, Jennifer Purcell. Living with a Visible Learning Challenge is the name of this podcast. And today we will discuss the challenges and triumphs of those who are neurodivergent living in a neurotypical world that was built for neurotypicals, not neurodivergence. And I hope that this podcast will not only open up your eyes to the challenges that neurodivergents have, but also the ones that maybe neurotypicals have that we can share with you, even if you're not neurodivergent. And also, I have interviews on here with neurodivergent advocates and also with neurotypicals that work with neurodivergence to see how we can interact with each other and how we can embrace our differences and similarities and try to understand each other and come to common grounds and be able to, just kind of help each other live a more harmonious and easier life. All right, so today I'm here with Christina, and I'm going to be interviewing her about her two jobs that she did with the Marines and with Notre Dame and with William and Mary, correct?
That's all right. Thanks, Jennifer. Nice to see you again and be here.
So how long have you been helping Marines and their families with special ed judges, justice, excuse me?
So I was fortunate enough to kind of start my career doing special education law work. While I was at William and Mary and running a special ed clinic there, I got more exposed to the military and how those families sort of had particular challenges in special education because they were moving so much. The schools were, in some cases, sort of waiting them out or not giving them the services they needed because they knew they would leave. So I had the opportunity to do some training of military attorneys, and shortly thereafter, I ended up interviewing and taking a position with the Marine Corps. So I was with the Marine Corps at Quantico for 2 years, where I was
Mm-hmm.
an attorney for their families that had kids with disabilities in Virginia, Maryland, and DC. And from that position, I ended up coming back to Notre Dame, which is where I got my law degree, to start a clinic here. So we're actually still helping some Marines. I have what I call some legacy cases, some things that weren't finished yet. We've taken on some new ones. And I want that very much to be part of my mission here, but we're also sort of helping more local Indiana families as well.
Okay. Um, and how would you compare the Marines to the Notre Dame school?
So at Notre Dame, I'm running a clinic. So I have students who are working under me. I teach them special ed law, and then I supervise them working on special ed cases. So I'm still very involved in the cases, but in a little bit of a different way. Whereas when I was with the Marine Corps, it was just me being the attorney. So I was
Mm-hmm.
sort of point of contact for them and those kinds of things. I'd say I'm still learning Indiana and what kind of issues are more unique to this area compared to what I was very accustomed to in Virginia. I had a little bit of Maryland as well. But I would say, special ed problems sort of persist across. It's not as if they're only in one geographic area. You can kind of find them all over
Right.
the country. So, the families are, unfortunately, it's a very difficult process to navigate. And in both roles, I think the goal was to try to help them get through that process. to get what their kids needed, to advocate for them, to teach them to be self-advocates. And then here at Notre Dame, I have the added job, which is sort of a primary job of educating law students and preparing them to be attorneys. And through that, they're doing service to this community.
Okay. Um, so with the families, what have been some of your most difficult cases that you're, of
Mm.
course, allowed to share?
Yes, thank you for the caveat. I'd say that a lot of the most difficult cases have to do with children that have behavioral challenges. It can be very difficult to know sort of how to approach them in ways that's going to sort of correct the behavior or get it under control to the extent that there can be sort of meaningful learning. And I've seen some schools do it well. You know, they bring in a board certified behavior analyst and they do the functional behavior assessment and they get them the intervention plan and do all of the things. And when it's not working, they come back to the table to try to
Hmm.
solve the problem. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of schools do other things like send kids home really early in the day, repeatedly, suspend them
Hmm.
frequently, try to get them placed into other kinds of schools and kind of make it seem like the parents don't have much of a choice in the situation. And rather than sort of trying to get to the solution to the problem, their solution sometimes is to just try to push them out. And I think that's where there's been, I think, a lot of friction because you want to preserve the integrity of the classroom and make sure that kids are learning, but at the same time, but you also need to unlock the resources that that child needs
Right.
to make it happen. So I think those are sort of the cases that I find the most challenging. But I've also, you know, I've seen a variety of issues, but I'd say that's the one that is particularly hard to wrap your head around and is one that I see recurring a whole lot, these same problems.
That makes sense. So how did your education at UC Berkeley and Notre Dame help prepare you for your job?
It's a great question. So Berkeley certainly, now Jennifer, you know, because you're a fellow
Right.
there. Berkeley toughens you up. Berkeley challenges you to think differently, think outside the box. It's not going to hold your hand through anything. You have to
Hmm.
kind of dive in both, you know, head first and kind of figure out how you're going to navigate through problems on your own. I think that's very applicable to sort of what I do, where the answers aren't always just directly found in the law. A lot of the time, it's trying to be creative, trying to find the right resources, bring in other people, and also just have the determination that you're not going to let it go, right? That you're going to solve the
Yes.
problem. So I think Berkeley, you know, it wasn't as if I was necessarily studying special education at Berkeley because that wasn't really an option. You know, I was doing business school and confronted with all kinds of different issues. I
Hmm.
very intentionally chose business school so that because I hoped at some point I would have some management kind of opportunities, which very much has been the case. So I'm grateful for that. But I think Berkeley more so, I think just taught me the resilience that I would need to do well in the jobs that I've had and in the, trying to deal with the system and also not lose sight of the bigger picture of what's happening. It can get very frustrating when you're looking at individual cases, but you know, to be able to zoom out and see, okay, what are the more systemic issues? Notre Dame, on
Hmm.
the other hand, obviously, you know, I was doing a lot more specifically law things. There wasn't necessarily a program here that had to do with what I wanted to do. Think I took some of those Berkeley lessons and kind of carved my path. Notre Dame was wonderful in giving me a lot of opportunities and leeway to explore what I wanted to explore, helping me find externships and internships. And, you know, I got to do a lot of disability rights related things while I was in law school. But I also did other things. You know, I was, you know, doing moot court and practicing a lot of oral argument. I was part of an organization that sort of supported public interest discovery amongst students. So I was exposed to different kinds of public interest lawyering, which ultimately I think helps me know where to look for different
Right.
kinds of things. But I think both were instrumental in sort of my formation as a human, but also, as a lawyer and as a disability rights advocate.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I agree with you. Berkeley definitely does help you prepare for challenges. And I mean, for me, I remember when I was there, I think that was a big time for me just learning more about myself because that's when I got diagnosed with NLD and
Mhm.
being able to um, better understand myself and realize, oh, this is why I'm having all these challenges.
I I can only imagine the added struggle sort of on that front and that journey of self-discovery. I can say on my end, with students that we work with children, right? The goal, part of what we're doing is trying to make sure that they get identified early and that they're
Right.
given the services that they need in elementary, middle, high school so that they are better prepared to be able to navigate kind of the college sphere. And we do talk a lot about, the kinds of accommodations that are going to look different in college and that kind of thing. So I'm sure you're well versed in trying to navigate all of those different systems.
Yeah, I try to be. So it sounded like for you, it was your cousin who inspired you to serve with the Marines and their families, right?
Yeah, so I have a cousin with autism. The backstory there is, we grew up really close.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, she had a number of school related challenges. She was,
Mm,
going to school after school. They were moving her place to place because they couldn't find the right spot for her. They found a really great spot for her, and she was starting to make some progress. And unfortunately, the school district said, like, no, no, let's try, school number 7 or whatever it was. It was a ridiculous number.
wow.
And my aunt and uncle got an attorney, and lo and behold, sort of everything changed for her. She's actually still at that same program. Now she's an adult and she's in their adult
Mm-hmm.
program. But once they kind of lawyered up, they were able to get what they needed for their daughter. And it just kind of always stuck with me that they, two very, highly educated people had to turn to someone else to be another expert to be able to navigate the system and get what they needed. And that also was something that they were fortunate enough to have the resources to do, whereas not every
Mm-hmm.
in the, in her shoes would have had that same advantage. So I was very fortunate to be able to kind of learn from that experience and feel that kind of calling to serve the disability community, in part because I had kind of grown up in it and I did some volunteering in her schools and programs and that kind of thing, but also to see like there's a legal issue and a legal piece that I had always been kind of drawn to, and there was a way for me to kind of marry my interests and to pursue special education law. I'd say getting to work for the Marines was an incredible blessing. It wasn't one I foresaw coming.
Mm-hmm.
It was a really wonderful experience to be able to kind of serve those who serve us.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. How did you know you wanted to work with the Marines and their families in special ed?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, special ed sort of
Mm-hmm.
always been the motivating factor for me. I think that the Marine Corps offered sort of a unique lens through that. It gave me an opportunity to grow and to be around a very different culture. I was in an office where I was one of 3 civilians with a lot of, active duty Marines that are lawyers, and all of our clients were Marine Corps families. So was working with them and their spouses and trying to help their children get what they needed while they were on this duty station. It was just a really unique experience, and one that I feel very very privileged to have had that opportunity to work with that particular population. They have such unique challenges, particularly because of their constant moving and how much they have to cede control to the Marine Corps for a lot of their
Right.
lives, and how that can really impact how a family sort of progresses through what a lot of other families might be going through, but it's sort of a more acute situation for them because they're away from their families, their extended families where they might have more support. They don't have control over where they're going or how long they're going to be there. And there are programs to try to support them, but sometimes those can be difficult to navigate. And so, it was a great experience to be able to be alongside them and try to help them in the small ways that I could with their families.
It makes sense. And I would imagine that it's difficult for not just for the parents, but for the kids that are moving from different schools.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think it would be hard if you were a neurotypical child having
Mm-hmm.
typically it's every 3 years that they move, but they have to be kind of prepared at any time that can change. So, it's changing schools, but also changing states, and changing just all of those sort of social connections and uh,
Yes.
how things go and all of that. But you add in, the added challenge of, perhaps they have a child who transition is really hard for them. And because
Mm-hmm.
of disabilities, that can add a lot of other layers. And I think, unfortunately, that can lead to more challenges on the receiving end of where you're headed. But we were trying to kind of help ease the transition between the different duty stations, that they would have someone to kind of explain to them, okay, what's different here? How do you work here? What can we get you here? But also, once you are here, if it's not going the way you want it to, like, what can we do to try to solve the problem? Is it getting to a different school? Is it, going and
Mm-hmm.
advocating for, a different program or an aid or whatever it is that child would need. I think it was just helpful for them to have somebody else that was on their side, that was stationed on the ground and kind of understood how things generally operated in that area.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Did the way you serve the Marines and families change the way, sorry, did that change when COVID happened?
So at the time that COVID happened, I was at William and Mary. So I was
Mm-hmm.
running a special ed clinic that was more general we focused primarily on families that were experiencing some degree of poverty, and we did have Marine, or I shouldn't say Marine, we had military clients, but it wasn't, the focus necessarily. Um,
Okay.
but I'd say in terms of COVID, just from a special ed perspective, that was a very difficult time when a lot of folks that virtual learning was hard for a lot of people. It
Mm-hmm.
was very hard for students with disabilities, particularly those that are the most impacted by those disabilities. In addition to, of course, like, if you have ADHD, like trying to do virtual instruction can be really difficult. If you had, autism and trying to stay on task and behavioral
Mm-hmm.
regulate can be very difficult. Even things like dyslexia, where you need more hands-on kind of learning opportunities to be able to truly learn to read, all of those things kind of pose their own challenges. But I think families in some cases, they were more exposed to what was going on in the school and how their kids were being taught, sort of for better.
Mm-hmm.
In some cases, it was good for them to be able to feel like they could partner. In other cases, it was like, oh my, like they're not doing what I thought they were doing. And
Mm.
that's not necessarily the way that I would want my child to be educated. So it could create kind of some more challenges. But honestly, a lot of it was just, are they even getting educated? Are they even getting
Right.
that they needed? Are they getting the services that their IEPs, their individualized education programs say that they're supposed to be getting? And so I think, it's going to take some time before we sort of recover from that. I mean, granted, we're, a handful of years away, and I think there were efforts to try to, once we kind of came back and all of that, to remediate more and give more. I know Virginia, for instance, had these like stipends that they would give for families
Mm-hmm.
that get tutoring outside of the schools, and I think that was a really useful sort of opportunity for a lot of families. But all that to say, like, those were really critical developmental years, and I think it's going to take some time before we feel like those kids have fully like caught up from what they unfortunately missed during that period. I will
Yeah, I can imagine.
add into that. Sorry, Jennifer, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Go ahead.
I think it was interesting to see how we moved from, so we primarily in special ed law, you're doing a lot of meetings in person with the school. It's a lot of negotiating and sort of trying to problem solve together and all those kinds of things. But it's usually, uh, 8 to 10 people around a table, and a parent walks in on their own and they sit at the end. And, it can be a very overwhelming environment, particularly when the school all seems to be on the same side, even if we don't really want it to be a side kind of issue. Um, COVID created this whole virtual meeting thing that didn't
Hmm.
really exist that I saw before that. And I think it's been a really positive thing on the whole, because parents can always now, like, it's a choice. Do you want to have a virtual meeting? Do you want to have an in-person meeting? And so for parents that want the ability to, be in a more comfortable environment, to feel like they can, I guess, engage in a little bit of a different way. They have that
Right.
voice, and it's also allowed people like me to be able to kind of get involved in different geographic areas, whereas before we were very constrained
Yes.
what was directly around us. So pre-COVID, I couldn't imagine having clients several states away, but that's exactly what I have now. And even when I was with the Marine Corps, I was up in Quantico, up in kind of Northern Virginia area. I I had clients that were pretty, an hour, 2 hour, 3 hours away. And sometimes I would go in person, but I had the opportunity to go virtually and also just kind of help take down some of the tension, I think, from being in that physical space.
That makes sense. I can imagine where uh, doing that virtually would be easier for you and for the families, being on your own turf, so to speak.
Right,
Um,
exactly. Exactly. And I think they could, there's something they will frequently, with clients I have now, with clients I've had before, maybe they text me during the meeting, like, hey, they just said something
mhm,
funny. Like, can we go back to that? Or I'll be like, could you mention this one thing that you mentioned to me before, rather than having to stop the meeting, like pull them out,
mhm.
talk to them. Now we can still do that. It still happens from time to time, but I think it allows for some more internal communication that can be really helpful.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I was gonna say when you mentioned the tutoring, I remember when I had that in I had some of that in Berkeley, and I also had that beforehand when I was homeschooled.
Mhm.
And that was really helpful for me. So I can imagine that would be helpful for other special ed students too.
Absolutely, especially when the students that I think it helped the most were students that perhaps needed particular reading interventions for, like, dyslexia, for instance, or if they needed
Hmm.
something that was different, or just a different approach than what the school was offering. So sometimes it was tutoring in the more traditional sense of, like, let's go over your homework, but most of the time, for the ones that were the most effective, it was a completely different strategy of instruction, a different method of instruction that, I may have been hoping the schools would do and arguing that the school should do, but it was very
Right.
nice to be able to say, like, oh, here's some funds, go to this, let's look at a bunch of options, go see, find someone that will fit your child better than, trying to fit the whole classroom, which can be
Hmm.
its own challenge.
Yeah, I, yeah, that can be its own challenge. I was curious about what ages you help mostly.
That's a good question. I'd say so. There was a period of time where I was getting a lot of middle school students, and I think
Hmm.
that was because, a lot of them develop very basic coping skills to get through elementary school. And then when we start, reading to learn instead of learning to read, it became more apparent that there were issues, or that's when you would see a spike in more behavioral things. They're getting bigger. It's not as cute anymore,
Right.
some of those things. I've had students all across the gamut. I've had preschool, I've had all the way up to, postgraduate sort of students that before they finish their high school. Um,
Hmm.
but I'd say, it sort of varies by locality. It's varied by kind of the different areas in the community. I right now I have more elementary school students than I've had before, but that doesn't I still have the the older kids too. But I actually see that as a good thing because I think when you get to middle school and high school, particularly for kids who are struggling to read, it's just harder. It's harder to be able
Hmm.
to meet them because they've lost some time. And we're trying to make sure that they're keeping up with where they are in school. There isn't that same kind of emphasis on, the fundamental reading or math skills, for instance. So I think when we're starting a little younger, it makes it easier to sort of craft the path forward that is going to lead to more success.
Right, that would make sense to me. Um, have you helped siblings before that have special needs together?
Yeah, I have. Particularly, I'd say more so in the Marine Corps. I mean, it did happen and at William and Mary, but you see a lot of what do you call it? Comorbid, comorbidities, sort of like you see a
Hmm.
lot of times where one sibling has something, another sibling has something. It may
Right.
not be the exact same thing, although or it may present very differently, which is always really interesting. But yes, certainly the siblings. Um, it's sort of an it's a very interesting kind of issue because sometimes you have to, the things that you're asking for can be very different for the two kids.
Hmm.
And what, the parents' approach to the child's can be, very, very different. But it also helps, I think, because the parents then have more experience with the system, right? So they kind of understand what they're up against or what they've experienced with one. Sometimes it's a little bit of a challenge to be like, no, that's an issue that happened with child A. That doesn't mean it's going to happen with
Mm.
but I think that awareness can certainly help. But I haven't really had the chance to work with sort of a sibling group where one has a disability and one doesn't, because the one that doesn't, I'm not usually involved in and seeing. But I think I do remember hearing quite a bit about that other sibling being protective of the child with a disability.
Mm.
That it's very much what we experienced in my own family. um, you just aren't necessarily getting like services for them.
Right, that makes sense to me. I was curious, with the clients, is it mostly autism or ADHD, or is it like it sounds like it's a mix of uh autism, ADHD, and dyslexia.
Yeah, I'd say those are the big ones. I when I first started, it was a lot of autism. I think as the longer I've been in it, I'm seeing more and more dyslexia cases, and I think that's because there is sort of more, there's a lot of push to make sure that schools are doing what we call like the Orton Gillingham or structured literacy method of reading instruction,
Mm-hmm.
where the research says you teach them in this multisensory way, and you want to make sure they're following the research and all those kinds of things. And I think parents have gotten more educated about how to approach those things, so it's just naturally kind of creating a little more friction. But I still very much see I have a pretty high number of students that have autism. ADHD, as you know, is also like a pretty high comorbidity rate with both of those disabilities.
Right.
I also see quite a, periodically, I shouldn't say quite a few, but I've definitely had a good chunk of students who have had an emotional disability. And usually when you get labeled as that, it's more of the externalizing type of emotional disabilities rather than the internalizing. So internalizing being like anxiety or depression. I mean, I think I've seen that a whole lot, but I've also seen the, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, sort of that group of things. Um,
Mm.
and my own personal bent is to try to avoid labeling those and because in special ed terms that can lead to sort of more placements with similarly situated students that can escalate behavior. Whereas I think if you have an ADHD or you have an autism diagnosis, the approach is just very different.
That makes sense. I didn't even think about the emotional ones.
Yeah, yeah. And it usually manifests itself in behavior issues. And I mean, so does
Hmm.
it. Autism can, but it doesn't have to. ADHD can, but it doesn't have to. I've also seen, even with kids with dyslexia, if it goes undiagnosed for a really long time, a lot of times behavior is what tips people off because the kids don't know how to
Mm,
read, so they act up in class so they can avoid the reading. And
right.
people just see the behavior rather than seeing the academic struggles sometimes.
That makes sense to me. I mean, um, I remember when I was a behavioral therapist, I remember one of my clients was he had hopefully what you can do with these episodes on this podcast, Living with Invisible Learning Challenge, I would like to challenge you to journal about the episodes and just see what you learn from them. Or you can share about the episodes with your friends and family and see what they can learn from them. And as always, I will post the links to the articles that I use in the description of the podcasts. And please let me know if you know somebody who you think would want to be interviewed on this podcast, or if you yourself would want to be interviewed. Please email me. I have my email on my website, and I also have it pretty much pretty accessible on Facebook and Instagram through messaging as well. So you can get in contact with me in those ways.